So we're standing at the headwaters of Proctor Creek here in downtown Atlanta, right by the 5 Points MARTA station over here. Proctor Creek really starts under our feet, and that's important for a lot of reasons. One is that when you look around where I'm standing, all you see is concrete. You don't see any water. And so that means that anytime it rains here in what we call the Gulch in Atlanta, all of that water has to go somewhere, and it all goes into Proctor Creek. And as we're going to see, that has impacted the history of this watershed and the people who live there in really important ways for hundreds of years. So the history of Atlanta really is a history of what elevation your neighborhood is at. Way back in Atlanta's early history, neighborhoods were segregated, but they were largely segregated on the basis of elevation, with white neighborhoods being at higher elevations and black neighborhoods being at lower elevations. And so the result of that is that water that was flowing away from downtown Atlanta and from higher parts of the city flowed through largely black neighborhoods. And not just water, all of the stuff that the water brings with it. So pollutants, sewage, and many other toxic and dangerous wastes. And so segregation really in Atlanta was not just a story of race, which, was the determining factor in where you live, but, that played out on the basis of elevation. And the results of that were, do you live in a safe and secure area, or do you live in an area that was flood prone and, potentially dangerous? So it may not seem like it, but this is a really great location to talk about environmental justice in America. Environmental justice is really simply based on the idea that communities of color face higher environmental risks from toxics, from pollution, from landfills and other sources than other communities. And that's largely based on race. And this part of Atlanta is a great place to begin to have conversations about what environmental justice means, where that idea came from, and how long it's been with us. Because I think looking at environmental justice through Proctor Creek and through the history of this really unique watershed shows us that environmental justice really is not a recent phenomenon. Scholars often think of the origins of the environmental justice movement as a 1982 protest in Warren County, North Carolina over the siting of a toxic waste landfill in a predominantly African-American community. But the reality is that communities of color have recognized that there are environmental threats that are both threats to the environment but also threats to human health and threats to civil rights, and have actively sought to combat those threats for much longer than simply the decades since 1980s. And Atlanta, I think, is a really good example of this. And Proctor Creek especially, I think, shows this very clearly. Because about more than a century ago, in the early 20th century, it began in Vine City when residents there realized that this company that had been hired to burn Atlanta's garbage was actually dumping it into Proctor Creek and were causing health problems for people living in the neighborhood. And so residents organized through Temple Baptist Church, which was in the community of Vine City. The pastor of that church actually led the fight against pollution of Proctor Creek by this garbage company. That action ultimately culminated in legal action against the city. They did not win that battle in the short term, but in the long term, their action really did play a key role in forcing the city of Atlanta to build the first sewage treatment plants to filter things that were actually being put into the water in Proctor Creek. That would lead to another 100 years of action to continue to clean up Proctor Creek, but that was a major victory in this effort. So more recently, Proctor Creek has shifted away from being something that's just been buried in Atlanta's historical record to something that's, kind of been unearthed and turned into a natural amenity for residents living in this area. There's been a lot of construction of residential housing in this area. The path has created several mile stretch of Proctor Creek Greenway for recreation purposes. And all of this is kind of redefining what it means to live near Proctor Creek, positively contributing to solving many of the problems that have plagued Proctor Creek throughout its history. It does raise other questions, and I think these are questions that Atlanta is going to have to confront in coming generations. How do we ensure that these amenities don't just go to the wealthy? And how do we ensure that they go to longtime residents of these neighborhoods rather than displacing those residents? That's going to be, I think, the central dilemma that this sort of re-envisioning of Proctor Creek brings to the city of Atlanta and to the communities that live in the areas surrounding Proctor Creek.